Lights and Asphalt, The Pacific Lightshow, edited by Tyler Jansen and written by Leon Danico. Introduction. July 9th, 2042 marked the final night of the Calgary Stampede. To some, the Stampede represented the most appropriate aspects of Alberta's heritage and was the place to be in the beginning of the Midwestern Canadian summer. To others, it was the most disgusting last-ditch effort to establish Albertan heritage. For Amelia Sire and Sophia de Leon, it was just another music festival, the first of which they'd be going to see since their return home in 2039. The Calgary Stampede would be the biggest festival the Northern Hemisphere had seen since the dubbed Reman occurred in 2035. The Reman was when the Canadian government shifted gears to become an exporter of not just energy, but general goods. They had the land, water, and the unemployed workforce to do it at the time. After the great neutralization that occurred across the globe in 2039, many of the larger and more powerful countries balkanized. Countries like China, Russia, and the United States. It only really happened to those with massive federalized armies that put up a strong facade when confronted with conflict. But their biggest conflict was in fact their unions. Unions of which congregated of many different identities being held together either by the very safety the armies bought or by currency. But facades are expensive pieces of art that tear with tension. These governments either found themselves on the brink of collapse, went bankrupt, or ultimately balkanized due to overspending. In the case of the early 30s, it was the result of massive defense budgets that were made in preparation for war that, for reasons unknown to all but a handful of people, never got around to actually happening. This left all the power that was in places like China in the hands of its provincial leaders that were part of very diverse cultures, which were just as suppressed as they were diverse. But the average person wasn't done spending upwards of 40% of their paychecks on cheaply manufactured goods and having them in their hands the next day. This created one of the largest manufacturing vacuums ever. In most of Europe and North America, warehouses were slowly becoming hollower as the months passed by. So, the Canadian government started throwing money into creating crown corporations that would make and maintain spaces that would be responsible for manufacturing all the random trinkets for the older generations, as well as the not yet conceptualized fidget spinners and hardware for the younger generation. Anything that used to be produced in big windowless rectangular prisms decorated with nets was to be manufactured in Canada ethically and with the help of automation. The government only owned the spaces, but gave contracts to management companies to operate them. The bidding wars for these contracts were waged based on a complex operation and efficiency score, which would be kept by the Canadian Manufacturing Board and would be marshaled into marginalized tiers of algorithms. Certain factories could produce higher volumes of goods than others based on location, and they fell into this tier system based on volume output and versatility. The profits governments made from the system went directly into funding public services. Anything that wasn't used got credited to each province, and a vote would be held at the end of each year to decide if the money should be spent on improving the province or paid out individually to each citizen. The profits adequately paid the elected officials who ran the show and increased earnings in an effort to keep things honest and as a reward for helping the people of the nation, not the people who hold interest in the nation. Of course, operators took a share of the pie, but there was more than enough to go around. Despite most of the manufacturing industry being run by the public sector, the private sector was still massive. Construction, real estate, pharmaceuticals, automotive, and more were all still the same as they were, but for some regulation changes. Several companies in the media and press have been broken up as the argument that oligopolies existed in the media became truth. This was the biggest of such breakups since the days of Standard Oil. These caused platforms to be spread so thin that they effectively became as plentiful as newspaper companies in the turn of the 20th century. To compete with potential monopolies, or even oligopolies, that would harm important supply chains, companies like CanFound, short for Canadian Foundries, were made. CanFound is a crown corporation that produces chips for computers, cell phones, cars, and more. Other branches made metallic parts for machinery and motorized vehicles. While mostly automated, CanFound plants produced most cell phones for populations that weren't using neural interfaces like the hard and soft links. The United States followed suit just as fast. Pacts were signed stating that if any such individual raised enough funding to buy these plants and/or companies, they would not have sold them to pay off debt due to government overspending because there was to be no deficits that outweigh the gross income of whichever province once the original debt was paid. The automated process was regularly revised. All machinery was to be versatile enough to produce and assemble the variety of goods that the future would demand and be supplied to meet the demand of operators that managed the crown spaces. Cars, like most things, were now built to be serviced and upgraded, as opposed to being built just to be replaced by a new model each year. To avoid toxic lobbying that would leverage people in power positions to change legislation and then sell off and privatize the crown corporations, or make deals for raw materials that are cheaper to harvest, politicians had to wear badges and patches on their suits in debate or political environments, if they owned any shares in any company. This rule applied to any money received from any company donor and was further enforced by making the prospective politicians wear badges for all the companies of any relation to an individual donor. This was also true for the wealthy who wished to enter politics. Facades like honesty are expensive. Automation was really the answer to the cost of electronic goods. The thing they most needed employees for was the shipping demand. Railways out of places in the Canadian Midwest like Saskatoon and Winnipeg became exponentially busier, so they needed to build more rails that lead to the Pacific coast and a brand new line that went south called the NASTBR, which was short for North Aller South Trade Bridge and Rail System. Maritime provinces and Quebec have coasts and pre-existing shipping routes that further enabled those provinces to develop plants of their own, with the obvious need to expand ports and increase population density. This not only was good for the economy, but also education. There was a huge demand for CNC engineers, programmers, heavy equipment operators, nautical science graduates, and more. This required the average individual to be better qualified for these fields, so education was refreshed through federal funding. After the losses made in the last 2 decades, they dug the average Canadian a deeper hole to climb out of with the acquisition of small modular reactor technology, which made energy very cheap and abundant, but was sold to countries in the South for a premium. The profits from these sales went back into public funding. The rails, on the other hand, made way for a new generation of international highways, which were constructed above the new rail systems to conserve land. One could call it a crown or socialist industrial overhaul, but it was more of a great catch-up by industry to see what technology had made possible without halting innovation altogether. Either way, coastal towns in most countries in the Northern Hemisphere benefited. Towns like Lorino and Larventia in the autonomous Okrug region of Russia saw massive foreign investment from the likes of shipping and receiving companies in Southeast Asia and were industrialized by what was left of American dollars to make train yards. While the new Russian government agreed to help fund and produce railroads across Siberia and into Eastern Europe, towns in the Sea of Okhotsk became places of great significance for not only tourists but also businesses. As the technological breakthroughs that enabled the development of Manitoba's northeastern grasslands could be used to develop marshes of the Okrug. To prevent future population crunches, as seen at the end of the 20s, at least 67% of all groceries consumed by Canadians had to come from Canadian farms. This increased jobs in the agricultural sector and kept towns slightly more alive, as no person or company was to own more than 4% of any agriculturally related market, excluding seed. This created a reward for maintaining large yields and allowed farmers to make a living as opposed to being trapped, and incentivized local farms to be owned by local farmers. Similar models were implemented globally. South America, even before neutralization, was a hot spot for the war, due to their precious metals and oil. Those resources attracted the eyes of money-hungry individuals who pulled the strings of big nations at the time. But in a new world trade agreement, the global community decided to throw money at countries like Argentina, Peru, and Chile to begin mining themselves. This funding came with the guarantee of cheaply provided automation, so that these countries could be paid a fair sum for the excess materials. There wasn't enough money in the world to hurl at them to establish foundries and refineries, so that's where the NASTBR proved its usefulness. The metals would be broken down in Mexico and other Central American countries. then be railroaded or shipped off to foundries in eastern US, Canada, mainland Asia, South Scandinavia, Germany, and Northwest Africa. The goods produced would be shipped to places with massive rail ports like the one in the Sea of Okhotsk that ran west into Central Europe, Western Asia, Eastern Africa, and the nations of the steppes. The world had found some peace and prosperity. How it all stayed together is a mystery to most. Many global strategists said that there was no humanly possible way to save the global economy, but obviously there was. This newfound peace had enabled some to discover, for the first time, true boredom with the world and all it had to offer. Some could no longer find purpose. Some say this feeling was at its infancy at the beginning of the century and had persevered through the struggles. Some say there's just nothing left worth doing in this realm of existence besides, well, existing. There are no new ideas, no new things to feel, and nothing will be quite as rewarding as the distractions manufactured by portfolios of old ideas. Ideas that are sifted through daily by handfuls of people in the basements of old Silicon Valley, leaving the last generation more confused and bored than any before, and creating a new one that is freer than ever, but too busy having fun in new worlds to exercise it. This younger generation is too occupied to be curious about anything lacking a title, too stimulated to look up or out, too captivated to wonder, too dissociated to dream while the sun is up, and too fulfilled to dream when it's down. But there are always outliers found throughout history. There are always people who can't stop asking questions, searching for purpose, and willing to stop at nothing to find answers. Forever, there is an individual somewhere doing something significant, or at least pondering it. Now, they could congregate across vast distances and communicate faster than ever before, without words. These are the stories of such outliers, and people so bored and confused that there's nothing else to ask but why isn't there more? Or, why am I in a Tim Hortons parking lot right now and not having a sandwich on the rings of Saturn? These are the stories of expats and the transitionary generation of the 21st century who find themselves in between the time after everyone was told to care about everything and the one where they try to convince people that there is something worth caring about. There is a passion vacuum in this world, but the dancing Leviathan sleeps where passions grow.